It's the week ending Friday the 11th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Sir Keir Starmer attending his first NATO conference as UK Prime Minister, the killing of 3 members of the same family in a crossbow attack in Hertfordshire, and Spain and England making it through to the final of Euro 2024. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Harriet Marsden and Rebecca Evans. And alongside them we welcome back climate journalist Jessica Hullinger. And Jess, as our resident American, I'm going to ask you first, will you be watching the soccer on Sunday?
Probably, yeah. I probably will. My kids are into it, and obviously my husband is pretending to be into it. He's a fair weather football fan, so...
Do you get to do it like the Super Bowl? So there's lots of focus on the advertising and you have chocolate M&Ms.
I would certainly love some chocolate M&Ms, but no, I don't think there'll be there's not going to be a halftime show. So that'll be missing.
You can do your own.
Well...
Harriet, you are a football fan, aren't you? I imagine that this is just unbearable for you, the tension at the moment.
I mean, what's more unbearable is all the people being like, oh, it's the first time England's got to this and it's the first time England manager's done that. And I have to keep pointing out that it's actually not. And we have a very good women's team. So I'm just basically being a resident, annoying person online at the moment. But apart from that, yeah, it's very exciting.
Rebecca, you're up first of our England women. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Project 2025. Blueprint to dictatorship or outlandish conspiracy?
Trump wrote, I know nothing about Project 2025. I have no idea who's behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. Anything they do, I wish them luck, but I have nothing to do with them.
Man, you almost made it, and then right at the end, you had to go and wish them luck. It's like in World War II when Churchill famously said, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the seas, we shall hope the best man wins. If you think it's ridiculous and abysmal, then why are you wishing them luck? I'd hate to see Trump in a monster movie. Godzilla, he's rampaging through the city, destroying buildings. He's killing our citizens, and we wish him luck.
Seth Meyers' monologue from his NBC show on Monday. Rebecca, he was reacting there to a clip from CNN in which they were reading out a truth, they're called, aren't they, when you post on Truth Social, a truth that Donald Trump had posted about Project 2025. What is Project 2025?
So it's a conservative blueprint for a new Republican presidency, presumed to be Trump's, and that's been on the kind of hush-hush in the past, but is now starting to grab attention as a blueprint for a future democracy or Republican democracy.
Well, you say on the hush-hush, but it was published by the Heritage Foundation, wasn't it, which is a conservative think tank in the States. On their website, it's been out in the open and discussed, hasn't it? Why has it suddenly got traction now?
I think that's an interesting point, because obviously if you publish a 920-page document on US politics and the complex ins and outs of politics, you're probably not going to get a lot of people to read about it. And I think it's starting to get traction now because it's been picked up here and there by people who do have the willingness to read that document and are potentially concerned about the content and therefore want to spread the message as much as possible about what's contained within.
Okay, and what is contained within, and why might Trump want to distance himself from it?
Well, central to this whole Project 2025, as I mentioned, is this 920-page document, which is called A Mandate for Leadership. It outlines this plan by nationalist Republicans to not only install a new Republican president, who we're now assuming to be Trump, but also to implement this sort of radical takeover of the US government. Lots of different plans involved in terms of what's going to happen, including replacing civil servants with Republican presidential loyalists, abolishing the education department, and banning the abortion pill. So all of these kind of policy suggestions have captured the attention of people who are worried about what a slide towards what is being considered as far-right American politics will actually entail.
Yes, it's not just a case, Harriet, is it, of saying, drain the swamp, we don't like the civil servants, the kind of thing we've heard before. It is a case of if this was a blueprint for the next Republican president, aligning almost everything in government policy with a kind of right-wing reading of the Bible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really important point there. Although you said that it's not just about draining the swamp, but actually one of the 4 priorities of this plan is dismantling the administrative state. So stuff like FEMA, the EPA, like logistical stuff, you know, that's about transport, food safety, environmental protections, and returning self-governance to the American people. There's a lot of very religious language used in this document, Christian language, not necessarily religious, but it's not actually all that Christian. I mean, if you like the rhetoric, but it's more worshipping this mythologized version of America rather than, you know, any god that we might recognize. But unlike Trump, I think, and we could talk about that more in a bit, I had not ever heard of this. I mean, I'm coming to the story completely new this week. I thought this must be some very esoteric, very kind of online conspiracy type thing. But when I started reading about it and reading about this kind of comprehensive vision for like a fairly dystopian future and like radical takeover of government, and how big and serious and actually quite possible it is, I was very, very, very taken aback. And I think we shouldn't make the mistake, people shouldn't make the mistake that I made of thinking that this is a very kind of niche conspiracy. I mean, this is very real and it's very big.
Do you agree, Jessica, that this does represent how a lot of people in the United States feel? Because reading from this side of the pond, it feels very extreme. Project 2025, for example, calls for the enactment of the most robust protections for the unborn that Congress will support, and for elimination of the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity and inclusion, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, from every federal rule, agency regulation, contract grant regulation and piece of legislation that exists.
Yeah, there's a lot of really extreme stuff in here if you look closely. And to answer your question, I do not think that most Americans would support this kind of policy making or these kinds of moves from the president. I don't think that this represents the majority. It represents the far right. It represents the extreme arm of the Republican Party that supports Trump, that has basically stuck by him through everything, and who believe, perhaps rightfully so, that he will win, and that will give them their opportunity to basically remake America in this weird image of, as Harriet sort of touched on, this sort of like biblical myth of America. One of the reasons that Trump has maybe tried to distance himself from it a little bit is this hard, extreme stance on abortion that you're touching on. So since the Supreme Court has reversed Roe v. Wade, there has been quite a lot of evidence to show that most Americans, and including conservative Americans, actually are pro-choice in some way, you know, on that spectrum. They don't want an outright, full, complete federal ban on a woman's right to choose. And you've seen Trump's language on abortion waffle in the last few years because he recognizes that. And so I think probably it's the abortion stuff that he wants to maybe distance himself a little bit from. And it's worth mentioning that the reason why this is in the news right now, I think, is because despite the fact that it has been out in the public since 2023, is because the Biden administration has its own crisis on its hands. And it is desperate to take the attention off of Joe Biden's age, and they want to use Project 2025 as the thing that they can point to and say, this is the America that we would be signing up for if we vote for Donald Trump.
Which maybe makes sense, Rebecca, as a political strategy, because, as Jessica suggests, the Biden camp are under a lot of pressure to even prove that their man has the ability to, you know, make it through another 4 years of running the country. But from Trump's point of view, I suppose this strategy of distancing himself from this, it's sort of easy to understand as well, isn't it? I mean, what he wants is these people's vote. He wants to say, oh yeah, they're good people and some of them will run states and they'll get to do their own thing. But I personally am nothing to do with those sorts of policies. That makes sense as well from his campaign point, doesn't it?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I'd say it does make sense because obviously he wants to appeal to as many people as possible and perhaps even capture a vote that he hasn't been able to successfully harness before. But I think Jessica's point about abortion is very interesting because obviously that is a huge policy issue within the states, and obviously a lot of people argue about it. But I think perhaps an equal reason as to why Trump might be trying to distance himself from Project 2025 itself is because of some of the quite questionable and alarming things that have been said by people who are within the Heritage Foundation working directly on Project 2025. One of the leaders of the project recently told Steve Bannon's podcast that this group is launching a second American revolution, and that it can be bloodless, but, quote, only if the left allows it to be so. So given the, previous recent history of the January 6th Capitol riots being so fresh within a lot of people's memories, I think that's quite alarming. And perhaps he wants to distance himself from some of that rhetoric that could spark memories of a more concerning and worrying time within American politics.
Yeah, I mean, Harry, I saw Marco Rubio be asked about that on CNN, Rubio obviously being considered as Trump's vice presidential candidate. And he said, well, he's not running for president, talking about the person who'd been speaking to Steve Bannon on his podcast. He's not running for president. Trump didn't say that. Is that enough? Just simply to say, well, Trump's not saying that personally, so therefore these people that run the Heritage Foundation, they're not to do with us.
No, I mean, it's not in any way sufficient. A lot of critics have said it's extremely unlikely that Trump has never heard of Project 2025, not only because we can assume that most of the time Trump does lie like a knee-jerk response to various things, but so many people involved in the project are really close to Trump and have served in his administration. And also the playbook was written by more than 20 officials that Trump actually appointed in his first term. So no, it's definitely not enough to say that Trump hasn't heard of it. I think it's extraordinarily unlikely. I also think it's worth noting that the guy that we were just talking about, the Heritage Foundation president, actually said that the US was already in the midst of a second American revolution. And I think that's really important because we're talking about this document as though it's a playbook that could be implemented in the future. But I think the point that we don't want to miss is that the end goals of Project 2025, a lot of that has already happened and is already in motion and is increasingly moving that way anyway. So it's not enough to say that the majority of Americans don't support these kind of positions when already, in the last Trump administration, the Heritage Foundation calculated that more than half of its policy recommendations from before Trump was president were implemented or proposed by Trump during his presidency. So I think we can say that this is already very much in motion, but I think that it's extraordinarily unlikely. I would say it strains any credulity to say that Trump hasn't heard about it. I also think it's worth mentioning that although, as Jess said, that Trump has wavered a little bit on abortion rights and is very much trying to court that vote, he has also repeatedly taken credit for overturning Roe v. Wade. He does, at least to a certain extent, know what's going on here.
Jess?
Yeah, to Harriet's point, the Heritage Foundation came out with a similar playbook in 2015, ahead of Trump's first term. And as she mentioned, he implemented 64% of it. And that included things like pulling out of the Paris Agreement and boosting offshore oil drilling on federal lands. And the list goes on. So there's a very real danger here, if that's how you want to look at it, that these really hard right extreme ideals work their way into the executive branch very quickly if Trump wins office again. And if you look at his rhetoric on the campaign trail, it's really difficult to see where he differs from all the things that are being outlined here. He has called for shutting down the Department of Education. He has called for cracking down on what he calls the corrupt FBI, which this document calls for basically gutting. He has called for expanding oil and gas, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really difficult. He can say he knows nothing about it or whatever, but his words and his previous actions speak much, much louder than any sort of denial he wants to put out there.
But if you're right, Jessica, that this is kind of re-emerged as an issue because the Democrats are taking out attack ads about it and bringing it back to the surface because of their own internal problems, yeah, maybe it deflects slightly from the Biden story. Here we are talking about this rather than Biden's age, but in a way, it sort of doubles down on the solution being, if you want to counter this, you need a really powerful candidate for the Democrats, and they don't have one.
Yeah, they don't have one. I mean, as we speak, there are more and more top Democrats that are calling for Biden or hinting that Biden should step out of the race. The Democrats are in real trouble going into 2024, and they have to decide, like now, what they're going to do. The fact that it has gotten this far and gone this extreme, and that all of the things that Trump did during his first presidency and all the things that he said after the January 6th Capitol attack, and not to mention his criminal record that he now has. The fact that he, despite all of that, is still the front runner. I mean, America it knows what it's getting into. I don't know that a document like this is going to change its mind. This is just the icing on the cake, I think, for all the things that we already know that Trump is. And if the Democrats want to win, they've got to make a decision very quickly about how they're going to do that, because I would say their ship is sinking.
Yeah, I mean, however serious this is, Harriet, the bottom line is it does sort of feel from this point like a rational sort of assessment of where America is that Trump's going to be president again, and it will be a bit more like a dictatorship than it used to be.
Yeah, I wish I could disagree with that. This is the thing that I think the media made such a mistake with, is that the accepted narrative became that very poor, uneducated, put upon, hard done by, left behind rural voters are the ones that went for Trump, basically with the sort of subtle condescending implication that they couldn't possibly know any better. And it's also, I think, a mistake to imply what I think is a false equivalence between a man like Biden, who for whatever reason, whether it be health reasons or age reasons, may or may not be competent to do the next 4 years as president, between that and a man who we know is a convicted felon, who we know is a sexual assault perpetrator and has urged people to do the same. We know that he's been using more and more dictatorial rhetoric, more and more very, very, very fascist language. So let's just not make the mistake of confusing one vision of America with another.
I just want to add that it is a huge failing of American politics in general. Something has gone very wrong that those two things are seen as equivalent.
Agreed.
Yep.
Agreed. Okay, Harriet, you're up next talking about a tiny British overseas territory. And still to come, are we any closer to living on Mars? It's after this. Okay, Harriet, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has Paradise Island become a permanent prison?
Deep in the heart of the Indian Ocean, nearly 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continental landmass, lies the humble islands of Diego Garcia. A modest ring-shaped atoll of just over 30 kilometers square in total land area, Diego Garcia snakes through the water like any one of the hundreds of similar islands scattered around the world. But the story of Diego Garcia is not just the story of any old island. From its early settlement by France and then by the British East India Company, to the expulsion of a community who had made the atoll their home for generations, to the immense geopolitical relevance of Diego Garcia in the modern world, the island has been a lightning rod for controversy for the better part of 3 centuries.
YouTuber Simon Whistler on his channel Places back in January, in a video entitled The Most Controversial Island in the World. Harriet, what is the place he's talking about, and why is it controversial this week?
So this is this tiny island in the Indian Ocean called Diego Garcia, which is in the Chagos Islands, which is part of the British Indian Ocean Territory. But on this island, there's this group of asylum seekers that have been stranded there since 2021. They are actually the first people to file asylum claims in what we're going to call the BIOT, the British Indian Ocean Territory. But this week, the British court, the British Supreme Court of the BIOT, was due to rule on their claim that they have been unlawfully detained on this island since 2021. But at the last minute, the US blocked the hearing from taking place and wouldn't allow the judge and the court on board the military flight. And the reason for that is because this island is also the site of this very, very secretive sort of UK-US military base. So basically, this one island has become the center of this major humanitarian crisis, legal struggle, political, and very intriguing military agreement.
Okay, so when you say British Indian Ocean Territory, that's sort of, because it sounds a bit like former colonies, like the West Indies, you sort of in your mind might be thinking, oh, there must be a group of islands somewhere. But you look on a map, And it really is in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's near the Maldives-ish. But you look at it and you think, how is that split between the US and the UK? How did that situation even come to be there?
Yeah, I would honestly recommend looking this up on a map because, as you say, it is bang in the middle of the ocean, seemingly not near any land whatsoever. But how it was is that the Chagos Islands, which Diego Garcia is the largest of these about 60 islands. So the UK actually took these islands from what was then its colony Mauritius in 1965 and evicted the Chagossian population, which was more than 1,000 people, to build this military base on the island. And then they signed this agreement in the 1960s for 50 years with the US to use the territory, and that rolled over in 2016, and it's now set to expire in the next decade or so. But most of the island is under US control, and the US military can refuse access to any of the areas that it controls. But also Mauritius, which, since 1968 has been independent from the UK, claims ownership of the islands. And as we can talk about a little bit more later, most of the world agrees with Mauritius. So the archipelago, which is administrated from London basically ignores all the international rulings to say that these islands actually belong to Mauritius.
Jessica, were you surprised to learn about this week, or is this something that's come across your radar before?
I had never heard of this island before, and it shocked me to learn that the US had a military base there. Apparently, there have been bombers sent from this base to Afghanistan and Iraq. There is allegedly a CIA detention center there. It seems to be a very strategic location to have a military base. And it makes sense if you think about where it's located, right? I mean, it is smack dab in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but the Indian Ocean is a key trade route. More than a third of the world's bulk cargo traffic runs through that area, and 2/3 of the world's oil shipments. So, in terms of trade, and particularly in terms of energy trade and energy security for the world, having a military presence there is really important. If you want to have any kind of influence or control over that area, China has interests there as well. And China has been cozying up to Mauritius in recent years, sort of saying like, well, if the UK won't give you independence there, we can help you out with other things. And it's been funneling money into Mauritius. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense once you think about it. It's really shocking to me, though, that suddenly they would say, no, you're not allowed to come in and have a look at what's been going around. Because basically the hearing was going to allow people to come and have a look at the conditions that these people have been staying in for the last few years.
But also particularly shocking because although it's a US military base, it's on UK territory. I mean, and it was basically the BBC who were told by the Americans, you can't come and report on what is effectively a British trial.
Yeah, it boggles the mind, doesn't it? I mean, it really speaks to like the power of the U.S. military to be able to just refuse access to areas operated or controlled by the U.S., but on what is essentially UK ground. I mean, it boggles the mind that. I don't really understand it. But yeah, I mean, it's concerning, especially because like one of the claims here is that the conditions that these people are being held in are really poor.
Yeah, well, let's just talk about that with Rebecca. Because it's quite a hard story to follow this. So, as we've been saying, it's a military base, really, not a place intended to house asylum seekers, but that is what's been happening. So, who's there and what are the conditions like?
Yes, so about 3 years ago, some Tamil people from India and Sri Lanka, that is a kind of ethnic minority who have faced awful conditions in India and Sri Lanka, and who have essentially been ethnically cleansed, or the governments have been trying to ethnically cleanse that group. They decided to leave in search of hopefully a better life and safety. So they got on a boat intended to go towards Canada, but their boat became stranded essentially, and they were rescued by a US Navy ship who took them back to Diego Garcia, and they've been there for the last 3 years. Now, if you look at the island of Diego Garcia in pictures, you'll see that it's pretty perfect. It looks perfect. White beaches, white sand beaches, palm trees, crystal clear waters, all of the type of things that you would associate with an island that is geographically in the same region as the Seychelles, Mauritius, etc. But these Tamil refugees who've been on Diego Garcia have faced really, really shocking conditions. There are about 60 of them there, including about 16 children. And on this island, they've been confined to this fenced camp, which is roughly the size of a football pitch, and they're surrounded by a 7-foot-high metal fence. They've had their movements restricted. People have told various news organisations that they've been forced to live with tents which are infested with mice and rats and cockroaches. They've developed various diseases. Some of them have even, there are even reports that some of them have been driven to suicide because of the awful conditions there. But with that being said, that's such a stark contrast to how military personnel are living on that island, because they get to enjoy shops and bars and tennis courts and parties and bowling alleys. So this specific group of people are facing such hardship whilst trying to flee the hardship in the countries that they've essentially been ethnically cleansed from.
I mean, you do wonder, Harriet, why make those conditions so seemingly, allegedly oppressive for these people? What's the advantage for either the US or the UK in doing that?
Yeah, that's the big question, because the Foreign Office has said that the island's not suitable to house people waiting for their asylum claims to be ruled on. The UN visited the camp late last year and said the conditions amounted to arbitrary detention. I mean, I really think we cannot stress enough how bad the conditions are there, as Rebecca was talking about.
And yet this is a place where clearly for personnel, there are bowling alleys, there's air
contrast.
conditioning.
It's the contrast, like Jess was saying, it really speaks to the power of the US military, that although they allowed, the gym and the swimming pool to be visited by US cheerleaders and celebrity chefs earlier this year, they restricted access to a legal firm who's representing asylum seekers and the judge and the Supreme Court of a British territory. That doesn't make any kind of logical sense.
Well, might it be, I'm just, spitballing here, but might it be the push-pull factor, even though this island is in the middle of the ocean, if it is en route from Sri Lanka to Canada? Yes, these people ended up there by mistake. What they don't want to do is create an environment that looks welcoming.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if there was more freedom of movement on this militarized island, that could also actually increase the political pressure to bring these people to the UK, not Canada or the US. So it is a really interesting question as to what's going on here and why the US has done this, because it seems to be putting a spotlight on the fact that these asylum seekers are alleging that they have been victims of sexual harassment and assaults and made to live in rat-infested tents by the private security company that's guarding them, not the US military that's guarding them. It's a private security company, it's G4S. But I think the crucial thing here is that the UK is in defiance of international law, even maintaining supposed control over these islands. The UN's highest court ruled that the UK should give them back to Mauritius immediately in 2019. So we are in defiance of international law, and we're in defiance of the UN saying that these conditions are not suitable for their unlawful detention, and we're in defiance of our own Foreign Office saying it's not suitable. So the question is, what on earth is the US doing putting us in this position with this military deal that we've got with the US that is now under so much scrutiny?
But also, since that scrutiny exists, Jessica, what on earth is the US doing not allowing the press in? Because into that vacuum, there are conspiracy theories.
I don't know. The mind immediately goes to, well, what would it look like to uncover the horrific treatment that has been handed out there? I mean, that would be really bad. That would be not good press at a time when, America can use as much good press as it can get. That's completely me just speculating. There are other very big geographical and strategic military factors here. I'm really, really glad that we're talking about this, though, because I think that it speaks to so many injustices that still exist in a world where we've talked about the lingering effects of colonialization and how it's just insane that basically the UK moved in and kicked everybody out.
Yes, in 1965, not that long ago. You hear those stories, they're normally in the Victorian age.
Yeah, and a lot of those people are now seeking reparations from the UK and the US, so there's also that factor to consider. So there's a lot at play here.
So, Harriet, you've chosen this as your story of this week. What do you think is going to happen next, and why does it matter to everyone?
Well, firstly, what's going to happen next is the US said it would be willing to reconsider if the visit was conducted in a manner that addressed its security concerns, which are thus far confidential. So we don't actually know what those security concerns or their assessment of their security needs are. A virtual hearing was held on Tuesday, which, by the way, was the first time that these asylums, was due to be the first time they would have met their lawyers in person. So they're still trapped there. We don't know what's really going to happen now, but what we do know is that this is increasingly a high pressure situation. I mean, just earlier this year, the Foreign Office plans to give the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius were dropped, largely thanks to Grant Shapps. But this is, it's interesting what's going to be done with our new administration here in the UK as well. I do think this is going to get increasing international scrutiny. I do think that this is a worsening humanitarian situation, already atrocious humanitarian situation with, as we've talked about, massive legal implications.
Okay, from Grant Shapps to Shapir. You'll find out what that is after this. Okay, Jess, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
NASA made one small step toward Mars.
The path to Mars is beset with challenges. And the crew and their families have committed a year of their lives in service to NASA, to the country, and to humanity's exploration of space. And so thank you.
Kjell Lundgren, NASA astronaut and Deputy Director of Flight Operations, speaking at the Chapea Mission 1 egress event at NASA's Johnson Space Center on Saturday. Jess, what's the story?
Yeah, so this week, 4 people emerged from spending a year in isolation in a habitat that's supposed to replicate what it's like to live on Mars. And it's a 3D printed, 1,700 square foot habitat. It's called the Mars Dune Alpha, and it's located on NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas.
So people were living in a 3D printed reality in Houston, but pretending they were on Mars for over a year.
That is correct, for 378 days.
To learn what?
So it's part of NASA's big mission to send people to Mars in the 2030s. And so the idea with these sort of like isolation tests is to put people through the conditions that might exist on Mars. And that's not to say like the physical conditions. It's very, very difficult to actually replicate the incredibly harsh conditions that exist on Mars for humans. But the sort of social conditions and the conditions of like growing food, like they had to grow food while they were living in this place for a year, using very limited resources.
You're inside, but they wouldn't be inside on Mars. I understand the psychological thing of what's it all like being together in a space. But if you haven't got the environmental similarity, what's the point? I mean, what's the analog?
I mean, I want to pick you up on that. They would be inside on Mars. Like if we were on Mars, you would spend most of your time inside. There would be very little outside activity if you didn't need to go outside. It's a hostile environment. We are not meant to be there. But the point of these sort of experiments is to basically subject these people to the conditions that might exist there in terms of like social stuff. So like, do they get depressed? Do they get along together? Do they get lonely? What happens to your brain when you are only with 3 other people for a full year and you aren't allowed to see daylight? All of the sort of things that would happen to a human brain and a human body and your sort of emotional well-being when subjected to those really strange antisocial conditions. They were monitored throughout. They also did like other things, like they went on these like fake Mars walks. There was this fake Mars room basically that was meant to look like Mars, and they walked out on it and like performed like maintenance tasks. They had to like maintain the environment that they were in. And there was also a communications delay of 20 minutes, which is what it would be if you were actually on Mars trying to communicate with perhaps your loved ones on Earth. Earth. So there was that sort of like social aspect as well. So it was more of a social experiment, I think, than anything else. But yeah, so it was really interesting. They won't know all of the findings from it for a while. But yeah, these people came out on Saturday and stood in front of a crowd and waved, and then they went to be with their families. And this is the first of what will be 3. So there's another it's going to be basically an identical experiment for the same amount of time, doing very similar things next year, and then another after that. So this is the first of what will be 3.
Okay. I mean, it is interesting, Rebecca. I can't help but be sort of psychologically fascinated with that setup, but they're not scientists. Not only is the environmental pressure not analogous to Mars, but also the kind of people that are putting themselves... I mean, they got to wear a NASA outfit for the press call, but they're just normal people that have volunteered to participate in this. They're not astronauts. So if you're not doing it with astronauts, how can you actually representatively test how it might affect them?
Well, I believe that participants had to have a master's degree in a STEM field. So they're sort of adjacent to astronauts. They have like biological and other scientific experience. So probably better than you or I or anyone on this podcast, perhaps Jessica as the exclusion, might fare in that kind of environment. I just think it's like a Big Brother, Love Island without the love sort of experiment to socially see how we will cope. I just think that aside from the physiological concerns that actually living on Mars, not this kind of simulation, might cause, the kind of mental health side of things to me seems like the main concern here. I don't think that anyone would really fare too well, as we've probably learned from COVID and lockdown restrictions there, with being in a fairly cramped. I mean, 1,700 square foot is not too bad. I mean,
it's quite cramped.
It's quite cramped, but I mean, it's quite cramped for a year. But it's like living in a house, isn't it? I mean,
a house with red sand on the floor and no daylight. I mean, that's the other thing. I was looking at it and thinking it is quite useful to see a representation of what Mars would actually look like if you were living on it, because it's so romanticised, isn't it, Harriet, the idea of being on Mars, let's start a colony. But I mean, I know this sounds like a really plebeian point to make, but that floor, that red sand for the rest of your life, that's depressing.
I honestly don't think it's a plebeian point at all. I actually think it's a really good point. Why this fascination? Before we get into that, please go and look at the pictures. It is so interesting, where you see the little food growing systems that they've got inside that kind of look a little bit like weird little fish tanks, and the sort of very prison-esque sleeping quarters. It's absolutely fascinating. But to your point, like, what is so good about the idea of living on Mars? I mean, as Rebecca and Jess have both spoken about, not just the mental drama, the psychological significant impact, but also the physical impact of living in that way. But humans have been fascinated with Mars for such a long time. Like, I didn't realize actually that we've been planning missions to Mars since like at least as far back as the 1950s. And we had the first Viking probe in 1976. And there's all these plans, like from kind of small research outposts to these major settlements, like Elon Musk's kind of grandiose and pretty ridiculous plan to put 1 million people on Mars by 2100, so about like 80 years from now. But with all the problems mounting up on Earth, big problems ranging from politics to economics to climate crisis to just about everything else we speak about regularly on this podcast, the impulse to fund these missions has kind of been ebbing away. So this is really interesting in that respect as well. And I think that it speaks to a wider thing that's at play, which is kind of similar a little bit to what we touched on in the last story about this bigger race between the US and China, which is this big kind of burgeoning space race that's going on between the US and China really trying to position itself as the next big space superpower. This space race is really hotting up, and I think that's probably, more interesting to us than it just looks awful. It looks awful.
And maybe not as exciting as it used to, Jess. I mean, it feels to me sort of instinctively that probably by 2100, man, to use the generic term, will have gone to Mars. But so what? Like, we've been to the moon, but nothing's going to happen. It'll just be a race to get to Mars, and then what? What's the point?
Yeah, There are obviously a lot of really good scientific reasons to study Mars, right? It is somewhat similar to Earth as far as all the planets go. Studying it can tell us a lot about sort of the evolution of our solar system. It can tell us about how life thrives or doesn't thrive, if indeed we can confirm that there was at one point life on Mars. There's a huge scientific value to being there. However, most, if not all of that research can be done now by robots and by rovers. And as AI becomes even better over the next few years, we can also do it with AI. Technology will be able to do this for us, and for a lot cheaper and a lot safer and without risking anybody's lives. The cost of sending the rovers to Mars has been something like $2 to $3 billion, which obviously a lot of money. But the estimated cost of sending humans to Mars for one mission is something like $1 trillion to $2 trillion. That is an extraordinary cost for something that we don't even know would benefit us in any way, benefit people on Earth in any way. Mars, as I said, is an incredibly hostile environment. You mentioned the sand. So I didn't know this, but the dust on Mars is full of endocrine disrupting hormones for humans, which would mess up the human body. It would disrupt our blood pressure and our heart rate. So just that alone, trying to keep the sand and the dirt from Mars out of the habitat that we would be living in. What a ridiculous, a huge challenge. There's no ozone layer. There's no magnetic field. The radiation sickness alone would kill us within 4 years. So living there long term is a really interesting idea, but I don't understand how it would be done. I don't understand what the benefits would be either.
You also talked about the space race with China earlier, and I have to say, looking at this footage of this, press event where these people returned, you did sort of look at it and think, have they actually got the money to do this? This is going to have to be an international effort, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think it's interesting because this experiment has actually been done before by China. Right. China, Russia, and the European Space Agency did a Mars isolation experiment between 2007 and 2011 where they put people in an isolated condition that would replicate the conditions on Mars, and they stayed there for 1.5 years, and then they pulled findings from it about how it affected their mental health. And by the way, the findings weren't great. I can read you a quote from one of the researchers. So they sent 6 people into this environment for over 1.5 years. 4 of those people showed, quote, at least one issue that could have exploded or led to severe adverse effect during a Mars mission. NASA doesn't want to say it, but this research has already been done. I don't think there is any actual scientific value to doing this kind of research, especially when it's already been done. And I agree. I think it's a huge. I'm showing my bias here, but I think it's a huge waste of taxpayer money.
Yeah, I've never been accused of being a cynic in my life, but were I a cynic, I might say, as Jess and Rebecca have said, this is a huge, huge, huge amount of money with seemingly very little tangible benefit. So then you have to wonder, well, the US is not going to be wasting billions or trillions on this planned mission to Mars and on the missions that are ongoing, the Artemis missions to the moon that are actually ongoing. They're not going to be doing that unless they think that there is a long-term overarching benefit. And we have to see that through the prism of the space race with China and the potential mineral resources both on the moon and in the future on Mars as well. I don't think that a lot of people know that the NASA is actually leading the first crewed missions to the moon since Apollo 17 in 1972. So these are the Artemis missions, which would be the first crewed moon landing to use Elon Musk's SpaceX Starship. That's due for 2026. Yeah, there's a lot of money at play here. I don't think anyone would believe that the US and China are throwing good money after bad for absolutely no reason. This is a bigger geopolitical posturing. This is very much a sort of my space rocket is bigger than your space rocket, but it's also about the future and about potential resources and potential benefits down the line.
If I could get you a ticket, Harriet, to join me and do the first podcast from Mars, would you?
Oh God, no, I want to go to Mauritius.
Let's reclaim the biot. My thanks to Harriet, Rebecca, and Jessica. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with the trial subscription when you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.